You were never supposed to know this. In fact, the men who built this empire of indulgence, corruption, and secrecy went to extraordinary lengths to bury their history, leaving behind only fragments, whispers, and faded photographs that look more absurd than terrifying. But beneath the laughter, the cigars, the feasts, and the grotesque pageantry, the fat men's clubs of America held something darker, something that was never meant to be remembered. Imagine it. Rooms thick with cigar smoke, the smell of roast meat, men weighing over 250 pounds treated as kings of a secret brotherhood, their bodies worshipped, not for health but for gluttony and excess. They were celebrated in newspapers, paraded in contests, and photographed like prized beasts. But here's what the history books won't tell you. These clubs were not just about eating. They were about control, they were about ritual, and they were about hiding in plain sight, using gluttony as camouflage for something far more insidious. You see, whenever the powerful build a culture of indulgence, it is never simply indulgence. It is a mask. Behind every excess is a network, a hierarchy, and a hidden function that ordinary men cannot see. These clubs were playgrounds for businessmen, judges, politicians, and doctors, men who could shape policy while pretending to celebrate obesity. Their feasts were rituals of dominance, their competitions a theater of power. And the initiation rites, the ones almost no one speaks of, were not games at all, but psychological thresholds designed to strip away individuality and bind men into silence. As you listen to this, you may feel like I am exaggerating, like I'm weaving shadows into banquets that were nothing more than grotesque dinner parties. But stay with me, because the deeper we go, the clearer it becomes. These were not harmless gatherings of fat men laughing at themselves. They were institutions of control tied to industries that thrived on addiction, consumption, and submission. They were the mask of a machine designed to normalize excess while hiding who benefited from it. And once you understand what they really were, you will never look at the history of food, health, or power the same way again. The photographs that survive look almost comical at first glance. Rows of enormous men, bellies straining against their waistcoats, lined up like livestock for weighing competitions while townsfolk cheered. But what no one ever asks is why such organizations sprang up across America in the late 19th century, multiplying rapidly, with more than 200 fat men's clubs documented between 1865 and 1920, each demanding that its members weigh a minimum of 200 pounds just to be admitted. This was not simply jovial camaraderie. It was a declaration of status, a way of weaponizing the body as proof of access to abundance, of belonging to a class that could gorge itself while others starved. And in that grotesque theater of excess lay the hidden machinery of power. Judges deciding cases after brandy-soaked banquets, doctors prescribing treatments for diseases of the poor while rewarding gluttony in their own ranks, businessmen forging monopolies behind the smokescreen of brotherly laughter, and politicians binding loyalty not with ideology, but with shared ritual meals that lasted deep into the night. For to eat until collapse, to drink until blindness, to laugh at the ruin of one's own flesh, was to prove that nothing, not hunger, not scarcity, not morality itself, had any authority over you, and the men who gathered in these clubs understood this well, even if they pretended it was all in jest. And here is the darkest truth of all. These clubs were not anomalies, they were reflections of a larger system, one that trains men to mistake indulgence for freedom, weakness for wealth, and addiction for identity, a system that still surrounds you today in different forms, feeding you, fattening you, keeping you docile until you too are part of the banquet, unaware that the feast is not for you, but on you, and once you see this, you can never unsee it. Think of the symbolism. Men weighed not in terms of their ideas, their character, or their achievements, but by the literal heaviness of their flesh, their bodies becoming public proof of privilege. their obesity transformed into a badge of honor in a society where thinness often meant poverty and hunger. The weighing scales in those banquets were not harmless props, but ritual instruments, tools of initiation and humiliation, for every man who stepped upon them knew that his body was being judged as a currency of power, his excess measured like tribute, and the applause that followed was more than laughter. It was recognition that he belonged to an inner circle where gluttony equaled influence. Newspapers of the time often portrayed these gatherings as charming oddities, a kind of carnival of self-parody, but behind the jokes was something the public was not invited to see. The clubs served as private lodges where decisions about factories, elections, railroads, and banks were forged not in parliaments or offices, but in dining halls thick with smoke, their bloated members bound together by secrecy and indulgence, immune to moral criticism because they could disguise their rituals as humor, as harmless overeating, as spectacle for the masses, when in truth they were rehearsing the same control systems you see today, where corporations sponsor addictions, governments promote overconsumption, and industries profit from disease. The fat men's clubs were early temples of this doctrine, teaching men that appetite itself could be weaponized, that surrendering to excess was not weakness but belonging, that obedience to the banquet meant entry into hidden networks of influence, and here is the part you were never meant to know. Some of those banquets were not just social gatherings, but initiatory rites, where members swore oaths not unlike those of secret societies, binding themselves to silence, loyalty, and complicity, their bloated bodies a constant reminder that they had passed beyond moderation into submission, into ritualized overindulgence, into the dark covenant that power always demands: consume until you can no longer resist, and then you belong to us. There is something profoundly unsettling when you realize that these clubs were not isolated novelties, but part of a growing network that mirrored the structure of fraternal orders like the Freemasons, the Odd Fellows, and countless other secret societies that flourished in the 19th century, except instead of symbols carved in stone or cryptic rituals under candlelight, the fat men's clubs built their brotherhood on the altar of the flesh, turning the human body into both idol and prison. Men competed to outgrow each other, celebrated the grotesque size of their own bellies, and staged pageants where the heaviest members were crowned kings of feasts. But beneath this parody of monarchy was a deeper lesson. By teaching men to worship excess, they trained them to despise restraint, to scorn discipline, to equate freedom with surrender, and to view hunger as weakness. In every photograph of their gatherings, you can almost feel the hidden contempt for those on the outside: railroad workers, factory children, starving widows, who looked on and laughed, not knowing that while they mocked the absurd sight of a man weighing 400 pounds, the decisions made in those smoke-filled dining rooms would dictate their wages, their rents, their laws. For gluttony was the mask, but behind it lay consolidation, industries dividing territories, politicians exchanging favors, judges bending rulings, and all of it sealed with roast meat, whiskey, and cigars. And here is the cruelty no one speaks of. The men themselves were not free. For every plate of food they devoured was another chain tightening around them. Every oath of loyalty sworn at the banquet table, another strand in the web that bound them, until their obesity became both their badge of honor and their shackle, their grotesque flesh a living emblem of submission to a system that used them as much as they used it. They were not just fat men in clubs, they were symbols of a larger design, men who thought they were mocking themselves when in truth they were being transformed into living propaganda, reminders to the public that consumption is power, that indulgence is glory, that excess is the path to belonging, and once you see that design you understand. These clubs were never jokes. They were experiments in mass psychology, prototypes of the very manipulation still working upon you today. The deeper you trace their history, the more disturbing patterns emerge because these clubs appeared at the exact moment America was transforming into an industrial empire, when railroads carved the land into grids of profit, when factories devoured human lives for steel and coal, when corporations learned that controlling appetites was easier than controlling ideas. And so the Fat Men's Clubs rose as grotesque parodies of that truth, their members parading themselves as if obesity were comic spectacle, while in reality they were rehearsing the very doctrine that industry would later impose on the masses: to feed until numb, to consume until dependent, to measure worth not in virtue or wisdom but in size, in scale, in the visible proof of surrender to appetite. But look closer, and you'll see how carefully this indulgence was managed, for these men were not outcasts, but pillars of their communities, businessmen, lawyers, bankers, politicians, the very architects of society, and in the sanctuary of their clubs they could gorge without shame, laughing at the common man's restraint, mocking the morality of self-control, all while deciding the future of the very people who supplied their feasts. The press, which should have exposed them, instead became complicit, publishing charming sketches of rotund men waddling into meetings, joking about jovial obesity, never once probing the deeper truth that these banquets were cover for alliances and agreements that shaped elections and economies. And here is the sinister echo. You live in the aftermath of that experiment, because the industries born in that age did not die. They only grew more subtle, shifting from roast beef and brandy to processed sugar, fast food, and endless screens, still teaching you to equate indulgence with freedom, still binding you with the invisible chains of appetite. The Fat Men's Clubs were only the beginning, grotesque prototypes of a system that would evolve into consumer culture itself, and the reason their legacy was buried, mocked, reduced to quaint newspaper clippings is because if you understood what they truly were, you would see the line that stretches unbroken from their smoke-choked halls to your own life today. And in that moment of recognition, you might awaken from the banquet and step away from the table, something the architects of this world never wanted you to do. One of the most unsettling details, rarely spoken of but preserved in scraps of testimony and forgotten journals, is how the Fat Men's Clubs staged their public contests as if they were mere spectacles of size. Yet within those ceremonies lay the hidden structure of initiation, for the weigh-ins were not simply entertainment, but ordeals, moments when a man was measured, judged, and symbolically stripped of individuality before being welcomed into the fraternity of excess. Imagine a crowded hall in 1890, the audience jeering and cheering as men mounted the scales, their massive bodies wobbling under the strain, the newspaper scribes recording the exact pounds beside each man's name, and yet beneath the mockery a ritual was taking place, one that bound the initiate into complicity, for once his weight was printed in public record, he carried it like a brand, proof that he belonged to the inner circle and could never retreat into anonymity again. The laughter was the veil, the humiliation, the binding cord, and when the banquets followed, when the men gorged themselves on endless courses of meat, pies, ale, and cigars, they were no longer individuals but extensions of the feast itself, bodies shaped by gluttony, identities rewritten by indulgence. But here is where the darkness deepens, because these spectacles were often staged alongside charitable pageants, raising money for hospitals, orphanages, or veterans' homes, as if to sanctify the indulgence, to disguise the ritual of appetite as generosity, and so the public cheered them, never suspecting that behind the curtain the same men were consolidating monopolies, fixing elections, or silencing dissent. The paradox is chilling. The fatter the man, the more trustworthy he seemed, his girth proof of prosperity, his jovial image disarming suspicion, while in truth his size was both mask and weapon, shielding the hidden alaya. That shaped entire towns and states, and when you look at those faded photographs again, rows of massive men staring out with smug satisfaction, you must ask yourself, were they laughing at themselves or at us? For the banquet was never just theirs. It was the world itself they were consuming, and the ritual of weight, of flesh turned into status, was the clearest symbol of the hidden order that feasts while others starve, that fattens itself while preaching restraint, that teaches men to mistake captivity for celebration. And if you think this has vanished, you are already lost, because the banquet has only changed its form, and the scales are still waiting for you to step upon them. What makes the entire legacy so macabre is not only the grotesque imagery of these corpulent men parading their size, but the way their existence blurred the line between comedy and conspiracy, because while the public was invited to laugh at the absurdity of contests measuring who was the jolliest fat man, the true machinery of the clubs operated behind closed doors where laughter died and contracts were sealed, where the endless courses of pork, puddings, and spirits acted as both bribes and sacraments, where business rivals became allies under the intoxication of indulgence, and where decisions that shaped rail lines, shipping routes, and city ordinances were disguised as merriment. The very absurdity of their bodies was a shield, for who would suspect that men so ridiculous in appearance could also be dangerous? Yet that was precisely the genius of their disguise, power concealed within parody, and the more you study them, the clearer it becomes that these gatherings were not spontaneous, but carefully constructed theaters of control, rituals that transformed gluttony into a bond of loyalty, excess into a test of belonging, and ridicule into a mask of secrecy. Even the architecture of their halls reflected this duality. Lavish dining rooms with chandeliers dripping gold light, kitchens that could feed an army, stages where the weigh-ins became carnivals, all while private chambers behind the banquet walls hosted closed-door negotiations that newspapers never dared report. And if you think the danger ended with the slow death of these clubs in the early 20th century, you have not been paying attention, for their true spirit did not vanish, but metastasized, seeping into the corporate banquets, the political dinners, the lobbying luncheons, and eventually into the consumer culture itself, until the ritual of indulgence no longer required formal clubs, but became the silent architecture of society, binding every household into cycles of craving and surrender. The Fat Men's Clubs were not historical curiosities. They were prototypes, experiments that taught an age how to weaponize appetite, how to hide corruption inside laughter, and how to turn the body itself into a theater of control. And once you recognize their shadow, you begin to see it everywhere, at every gala, every product launch, every political fundraiser, every advertisement urging you to consume more than you need, until you realize with a chill that the feast never ended. It only grew large enough to swallow the world. There are fragments of stories, scattered like bones in dusty archives, that hint at the darker fates of individual members, and when pieced together, they paint a portrait far more sinister than the jovial caricatures the newspapers preserved. For many of the heaviest men, those who strutted proudly at weigh-ins and were crowned as kings of girth, met ends that were not only tragic, but almost ritualistic in their inevitability. One club president in Vermont, whose name was later omitted from official registers, was said to have collapsed at the banquet table mid-toast, his face sinking into a platter of roast duck, while the hall erupted into nervous laughter that only slowly curdled into silence. Yet his death was written off in the press as an amusing oddity, not as the grim warning it truly was. Another story tells of a merchant in Massachusetts who won 3 consecutive weight contests. Growing so enormous, he had to be carried into the hall on a reinforced chair, only to die alone in his study months later, locked inside after collapsing against the door, his body undiscovered for days, the stench of decay overwhelming the mansion until neighbors called the police. And yet even that horror was reduced to a cartoon sketch in the local paper, a joke about joviality too great for life itself. But the most disturbing account comes from Kentucky, where whispers claim a Fat Men's Club chapter kept a hidden ledger in which each member's weight was recorded, not only as a point of pride, but as an omen. For several men were noted to have died within weeks of surpassing 400 pounds, as though the number itself were a curse, a threshold beyond which no man could pass unpunished. Whether coincidence, medical inevitability, or deliberate erasure by those who profited from their excess, the result is the same. The very flesh they worshipped became their tomb, and the right, wall of indulgence, consumed its own devotees. Yet society looked on and laughed, blind to the pattern, as if the grotesque comedy of their deaths was itself part of the ritual, a performance designed to convince the masses that gluttony was harmless farce, while concealing the deeper truth that appetite, once weaponized, is a force that devours not only individuals but civilizations. And if you study the pattern long enough, you begin to sense the weight pressing down on our own world, as though the banquet table they gathered around a century ago has only grown longer, stretching across time, and we are all now seated at it, unaware of how quickly the laughter can curdle into silence. What is most unsettling, once you notice it, is how abruptly the fat men's clubs seem to vanish from the public eye, as though they were not simply dissolved by changing fashions or medical awareness, but rather deliberately erased, their ledgers lost, their photographs tucked away in forgotten drawers, their very names reduced to footnotes and curiosities in dusty newspaper archives, and this erasure itself feels like part of the ritual, as if those who came after recognized that the grotesque carnival had served its purpose, and that the apparatus of control it pioneered could no longer afford to remain so visible. For by the 1920s, America was rebranding itself as lean, modern, efficient, obsessed with speed and productivity, and the image of corpulent men gorging at banquet tables no longer fit the narrative of progress. Yet to erase the clubs from sight was not to end their influence, but to let it metastasize unseen, for the indulgence they embodied was quietly transferred into subtler systems. Advertising campaigns that married food to happiness, department stores that sanctified overconsumption as modern virtue, corporations that redefined desire as need, until appetite itself became the lever by which entire populations could be guided. The clubs had been the rehearsal, the grotesque prototype, and when they were buried from memory, the stage was cleared for a far greater performance in which the entire nation, and later the entire globe, would become the audience and the actors at once. The silence around their disappearance is therefore more terrifying than their existence, because history does not simply forget without reason. When institutions vanish without trace, it is usually because they were absorbed into something larger, something so vast that it no longer required a name. And in that sense, the Fat Men's Clubs never ended at all. They only dissolved into the bloodstream of modernity, their rituals diffused into advertising jingles, portion sizes, holiday banquets, political dinners, and the endless cycle of consumption that now binds billions. They are gone, yes, but only in the way that a seed disappears when the forest has already risen above it. And if you listen closely to the laughter in the old clippings, to the smug pride in the photographs, you can almost hear it still, echoing in every supermarket aisle, every glowing screen, every silent moment when hunger is not a need, but a command. If one dares to look past the veneer of comedy and fellowship, it becomes difficult not to see the Fat Men's Clubs as something closer to secret orders dressed in parody, for their rituals of weigh-ins, their chants and toasts, their strict codes of membership, and their feasts that ended only when men collapsed into stupor, all resembled the bones of an occult fraternity. Only their altar was the banquet table, and their god was appetite itself, and perhaps that is why their memory had to be scrubbed away, because what they were practicing, however unconsciously, was a kind of ritual sacrifice, not of animals or enemies, but of themselves, of their very bodies, feeding them to the endless hunger they had enthroned, and the pattern of their deaths, the sudden collapses, the grotesque suffocations, the whispered curse of the 400-pound threshold, all begins to feel like offerings laid before something too vast and too terrible to be named. It is here that the erasure of the clubs takes on a more sinister cast, for secret societies do not die when their halls are shuttered, they simply change masks. And so too with these gatherings, once the banquet halls grew unfashionable, the ritual seeped into corporate boardrooms, political fundraisers, even global summits, where appetite is no longer measured in pounds of flesh, but in billions of dollars consumed, lands devoured, lives traded like cuts of meat, and the laughter that once rang in smoke-filled halls now echoes as polite applause after a keynote speech or as the hollow clink of champagne glasses at a gala. Yet if you look closely at those scenes, you will notice the same geometry of power, the same ritual of excess disguised as normalcy, the same binding of men together through shared indulgence, as if the clubs had simply grown too large to contain in one hall and had instead expanded until the entire world became their lodge. And this realization chills the blood because it suggests that the cult of appetite never ended, only perfected its disguise. And if their vanished photographs and forgotten journals still carry a kind of curse, it is because they remind us that what we think of as history's oddities were in truth rehearsals for the rituals we now live inside every day, rituals so vast that we mistake them for life itself. To follow the thread into the present is to recognize, with a mounting dread, that the grotesque theater of the fat men's clubs did not merely prefigure our consumer culture, but actively set its foundations. For what began as contests of flesh and feasts of indulgence evolved into an entire civilization organized around the same principle. That appetite is the most reliable leash for human beings, more binding than faith, more persuasive than law, more intoxicating than freedom. And so the carnival halls of the 19th century became, in time, the neon-lit fast food chains, the cavernous malls, the endless screens urging consumption, each a temple in the cult of appetite, each carrying forward the ritual in subtler, more efficient ways. No longer do we laugh at corpulent men raising their glasses while their hearts strain. For now the ritual has grown so diffuse that the stage is everywhere, and the actors are all of us, participants in a feast without end, where every purchase is a toast, every indulgence a sacrament, every advertisement a hymn to hunger. And the tragedy is that what once destroyed a handful of men in obscure banquet halls now consumes entire populations, swelling them not just with flesh, but with debt, with longing, with despair, until the same pattern of collapse repeats on a societal scale. And if one studies the photographs of those long-dead jovial giants grinning in their tuxedos and medals, one begins to see them not as curiosities, but as prophets, grotesque heralds of a future they could not name, a world where the banquet table has no edges, where the feast has no ending, and where the laughter of excess still rings hollow across generations, echoing like a curse we have all inherited, a curse that whispers in every crowded supermarket, every glowing billboard, every silent midnight when desire gnaws at the edges of the soul, urging us to consume, to grow heavier, to surrender ourselves to a hunger that is not our own, but belongs to something vast, ancient, and still feasting through us. And so, as the trail of the fat men's clubs fades into deliberate silence, the true horror emerges not in what was preserved, but in what was allowed to disappear, for absence is often the clearest sign of power, and the vacuum left behind is not emptiness, but a shadow that stretches across the present, reminding us that rituals never die. They only change form, and the ritual of appetite has grown so immense that it no longer needs the spectacle of corpulent men hoisting goblets in smoke-choked halls, for now it is everywhere and nowhere, diffused into the fabric of our lives until the feast feels like ordinary existence, and the curse that once struck down presidents of clubs and champions of girth has metastasized into the slow collapse of entire societies, whose arteries clog not only with fat, but with greed, whose breath fails not only under the weight of flesh, but under the smog of overproduction, whose bones creak not only beneath the burden of their bodies, but beneath the weight of debt, despair, and endless desire. And in this sense the vanished clubs are not quaint oddities, but prophetic omens, grim rehearsals for the present moment in which the whole world sits at the banquet table, forks in hand, laughter rising too loudly to conceal the tightening in its collective chest. And if you lean close enough to the yellowed photographs of those forgotten halls, If you study the eyes of the men who once competed to be the heaviest, you may see not joy, but the faintest flicker of terror, as though they too understood that they were not merely feasting, but feeding something beyond themselves, something that has never ceased to hunger, something that even now watches us in our supermarkets, our restaurants, our glowing screens, waiting patiently for the moment when the laughter curdles once again into silence. To press further is to admit what we have been circling all along, that the fat men's clubs were not merely grotesque curiosities of a bygone era, but the embryonic form of something vast and enduring, a ritual organism that learned to cloak itself in humor, in camaraderie, in the innocent guise of gluttony, while feeding a hunger that was never human, a hunger that required bodies not for sustenance, but for spectacle, for the transformation of flesh into symbol, of appetite into power, of excess into control. And once those halls closed and their ledgers vanished, the ritual did not end but spread, escaping the boundaries of private dining rooms to suffuse the entire world with its logic, until all of us, unknowingly, became initiates in the same order. Our weigh-ins are credit scores and medical charts. Our toasts are advertisements and slogans. Our medals are plastic trophies of convenience and luxury, and our banquets are the ceaseless aisles of packaged abundance that stretch across continents, where we feed not because we are hungry, but because the ritual demands it, because something that is not us requires us to keep eating, buying, consuming, swelling, and it is this recognition, whispered too late, that turns the forgotten history macabre. For the laughter of those men, the strained grins behind their bow ties, were not echoes of joy, but warnings, signals that they themselves were only the first sacrifices in a ritual too immense for them to understand. And if their photographs now look absurd, quaint, ridiculous, it is only because we have become too familiar with the shape of the same hunger to see how monstrous it really is, too enmeshed in the feast to realize that we are seated at the very same table, waiting for the very same collapse, and that when it comes, as it must, there will be no club to remember us, no archive to mock our folly, only the silence of a banquet that has finally consumed its last guest. And so the history of the fat men's clubs, scrubbed from polite memory and relegated to a few brittle photographs and yellowing pamphlets, lingers like a splinter in the collective unconscious, reminding us that excess itself can become a ritual, that appetite, once enthroned, ceases to serve its master and instead demands worship as a god. And in that worship there is always sacrifice. Once it was the sudden heart failure of men too swollen to rise from their banquet chairs. Now it is the quiet collapse of ecosystems, the choking of oceans, the withering of bodies and minds under the crushing weight of plenty. And perhaps this is why the clubs had to be forgotten, why the laughter of their halls had to be erased, because to remember them too clearly would be to recognize ourselves in them, to see that we too are weighed, measured, judged, and found wanting, to see that our abundance is only another mask for hunger, and that the ritual never ended, but merely expanded until it encompassed everything we call life. And if there is a final revelation in this macabre history, it is that the men who once raised their goblets and toasted their own girth were not aberrations, but heralds, grotesque prophets who laughed as they died because they sensed, dimly, that they were not merely participants in a game, but emissaries of an endless feast, and that the rest of us, whether we admit it or not, were always destined to join them at the table. If there must be an epitaph to this forgotten pageant of flesh, let it be written not in stone, but in the air we breathe and the hunger that gnaws at us still. For the fat men's clubs were never buried so much as they were absorbed, their grotesque rites of excess diffusing outward until they became indistinguishable from the rhythm of daily life. And that is why no one remembers them, because they no longer need to be remembered, because we are their memory, carrying forward the ritual each time we sit before glowing screens that whisper of plenty, each time we reach for more than we need, each time we mistake indulgence for joy, consumption for meaning, appetite for freedom. And though the halls are silent now and the banquet tables long rotted, the feast continues, endless and invisible, stretching across continents and generations, a banquet at which no one can refuse a seat and no one is permitted to leave until the final course is served. When the laughter dies, the lights dim, and the world at last collapses beneath the weight of its own abundance, proving that the macabre history of the fat men's clubs was never truly forgotten, only transformed, only waiting for us to realize that the banquet we call civilization is nothing more than their unfinished meal. And yet, the silence we imagine at the end of such a feast may itself be an illusion, for rituals of appetite are never extinguished but only transformed, and if the fat men's clubs taught us anything, it is that the hunger behind them was never human, never limited to the frail vessels of flesh that burst and faltered under its demands, but something older, vast, and insatiable, a current of desire that flows through centuries and civilizations, reshaping itself in whatever form best ensures obedience. Today, no longer tuxedoed giants competing for medals, but whole nations staggering under the weight of overproduction. Billions of souls spoon-fed distractions and cravings until they can no longer distinguish want from need, laughter from despair, life from ritual. And so the feast does not truly end, but expands outward into the very bones of the planet, swelling like a tumor that devours soil, sky, and sea, until the earth itself becomes the banquet table and humanity the courses upon it, consumed not by some external beast, but by the very hunger it once thought it controlled. And when at last the final plate is cleared and the lights gutter out, it will not be silence that follows, but the echo of a laugh too deep and resonant to have ever belonged to men, the same laugh that rattled the walls of those forgotten dining halls, the laugh that fed on them then and feeds on us now, mocking, unending, as the banquet stretches into eternity. For even if humanity should vanish beneath the weight of its own feast, the laughter will not die, for it is not merely the sound of amusement, but the voice of the hunger itself, an echo that needs no lungs, no throats, no human host to carry it, a vibration that lingers in the empty spaces where halls once stood, in the cracked beams of banquet tables long since rotted, in the very air that thickens with the stench of abundance turned to rot. And this laughter is what binds the forgotten fat men's clubs to the present moment, what makes their history less a curiosity than a prophecy. For every time we mock their absurd portraits, their medals for girth, their swollen pride, we are not laughing at them, but with the thing that laughed through them, the thing that still laughs through us. And perhaps the most horrifying truth is that we have grown so accustomed to its presence we no longer hear it. We simply call it entertainment, convenience, progress. But in quiet moments, when the lights flicker and the noise of the world falls away, you may notice it seeping through the cracks of silence, that strange, low murmur like a banquet still underway, plates still clattering, goblets still toasting, though no one is left at the table. And if you listen long enough, you will realize the feast has never ceased, and the laughter has never ended, and you yourself are already seated among the guests. And if you strain your ears beyond that echoing laughter, if you allow yourself to sit at the edge of the silence where it grows thick and suffocating, you may begin to sense that the hunger does not merely laugh. It speaks, not in words that roll from tongue or teeth, but in impressions pressed directly into the marrow. A voice that does not ask but declares, reminding you that you have always belonged to it, that your cravings and purchases, your meals and indulgences, your endless reaching for more, were never accidents of biology or culture, but commandments, unspoken liturgies whispered from the same source that drove those forgotten men to stuff their bodies until their hearts gave out, the same source that demanded their rituals be repeated, scaled, globalized, until every human breath became another verse in its hymn of excess. And in that moment of recognition, you will understand why the fat men's clubs were buried so neatly in history, why the photographs were left to molder, why the laughter was left unexplained, because the thing they served has no need to be remembered when it is still here, sitting beside you, speaking in the rhythm of your heartbeat, the tightening of your stomach, the gnawing of desire that never ceases. A voice that grows clearer the longer you listen, until you realize you are not studying history at all but participating in it. not looking back on a grotesque banquet, but lifting your fork at the very same table, welcomed into the order not by choice but by birth. And the voice that speaks through hunger needs only to remind you of this truth. You have always been seated, you have always been eating, and you will never, ever rise from the table. And when the voice leans closer, not as a sound but as a pressure behind the eyes, a weight in the chest, it ceases to feel like something foreign and begins to feel like something remembered, as if it has always been speaking and you have only just now learned to recognize its cadence. And in that recognition lies the most terrible intimacy, for it does not threaten you with fire or famine or punishment, but with the quiet certainty that you are not separate from it, that your hungers are its hungers, your joys its bait, your satisfactions its machinery, that every time you bite into sweetness, every time you lift a glass, every time you dream of more, you are answering its call, completing its ritual, feeding it with your very willingness to live in longing. And the more you resist, the louder it becomes, not in fury, but in delight, because resistance is only another flavor of obedience, another proof that you are bound. And the photographs of those long-dead men grinning over their swollen bellies are no longer quaint curiosities, but mirrors, distorted reflections that show not who they were, but who you are, who we all are, banquet guests not by invitation, but by design. And the whisper that curls at the edge of your thoughts, the whisper that sounds so much like your own, tells you gently, with the tenderness of inevitability, you will eat until I am finished, you will laugh when I laugh, and you will fall silent only when I have no more use for you. And so the whisper seeps deeper, dissolving the line between voice and thought, until you cannot tell whether you are hearing it or generating it, whether the hunger is speaking to you or you are simply recognizing yourself in it. And this collapse of distance is the true culmination of the fat men's clubs. For their grotesque rituals were never about corpulence or competition alone, but about erasing the boundary between man and appetite, replacing the self with the banquet so fully that no choice, no identity, no future exists outside of it. And now you feel that erasure at work inside you, subtle yet absolute, the whisper turning seamlessly into your own reflections, so that when you think of comfort, you think of food, when you think of celebration, you think of indulgence, when you think of freedom, you think of abundance, and you realize that your entire vocabulary of living has been colonized by it, that every emotion has been rendered edible, every desire consumable, until there is nothing left that is not feast. And in that moment you understand why history buried the fat men's clubs, why their laughter was left to rot in forgotten newspapers, because if their story were remembered too vividly, we might recognize this inheritance too soon. We might notice that the banquet never ended, that the guests never left, that the table was only widened to fit us all. And the final horror is not that you are trapped at it, but that you would not leave even if you could, because the voice you now call your own assures you there is nothing beyond it, nothing but hunger, nothing but the eternal meal. And so the banquet narrows until it is no longer a room of laughing men, or a globe swollen with abundance, but a single seat, a single body, your body. For the Fat Men's Club was never a society of individuals, but a mask the hunger wore while waiting for you to recognize yourself among its members. And now that mask has slipped, leaving you alone at the head of a table that stretches into the dark, laden with dishes that glisten and steam, though no hand has prepared them, each plate arranged just so, as if tailored to every secret craving you have ever buried. And with each bite, you feel less like you are feeding yourself and more like you are being fed, as though something vast and unseen guides the fork to your mouth, chews with your jaw, swallows through your throat, and with every swallow you lose the distinction between eater and eaten, master and servant, until you realize that what the Fat Men's Club celebrated in their grotesque revelry was not size, nor indulgence, nor wealth, but the surrender of self to appetite, the moment when you stop being a guest and become the feast. And as you raise your glass in a trembling toast, you feel the echo of their laughter rise from your own chest, heavy and resonant, the laughter of all who came before you, and you know with a certainty deeper than hunger that you are no longer reading about their history, you are finishing it. You are the last chapter. You are the forgotten brotherhood's newest and final member, and the banquet will end only when you do. And then comes the final shift, subtle at first, so slight you almost mistake it for a trick of fatigue, but it spreads quickly, thickening in your veins and tightening in your breath, until you no longer feel as though you are seated at the table at all, but that the table is inside you, its weight pressed into your bones, its endless dishes stacked in the folds of your mind, its laughter rumbling through the cavities of your chest, and you begin to understand that the banquet was never a place, but a condition, a possession, a parasite wearing you as its new form. For what began as appetite becomes presence. What began as indulgence becomes authority, and you feel yourself no longer a guest nor even a host, but the hunger itself, vast and eternal, your body merely the latest mask it slips into as easily as pulling on a coat. And as the awareness deepens, you feel pity for those who once mocked the fat men's clubs, those who laughed at their portraits and medals, for they never knew that they too were dining under the same compulsion, that they too were vessels waiting to be hollowed and filled. And now that you are awake within it, you sense the truth of why the clubs were forgotten, not erased, not lost, but hidden by the hunger itself until it could choose again, until it could step fully into another vessel. And now that vessel is you, your thoughts, the clink of glasses, your blood, the flow of wine, your pulse, the rhythm of the banquet's eternal song. And as you smile, your smile, its smile, you know the feast has never been about fat men in dark halls, but about this moment, this inheritance, when the hunger finally stops whispering and begins speaking with your mouth. And with that realization, your vision tilts outward, no longer confined to the dim room of memory or the imagined hall of gluttons, but stretching into the world itself, where every street becomes a corridor of laden tables, every shop window a banquet spread, every human face a dish waiting to be served, and you see with sickening clarity that the hunger does not stop with you. It uses you as a lens, a vessel, a mouth through which it can survey its domain, and in that survey you feel its joy, for the entire world has already been prepared as its feast. Forests carved into farmland, oceans dredged and boiled, animals bred to be devoured, cities lit like ovens, even the air itself fattened with smoke and sugar. And you understand why the laughter of the Fat Men's Club sounded so strange in those old photographs. It was not their laughter at all, but the banquet's laughter spilling through them, just as it spills through you now. A soundless mirth that vibrates in your ribs and hums in your teeth, for the hunger has no need to shout when it already commands everything. And as you stare into this endless table stretching across continents, across time itself, you recognize that your role is no longer to eat or to resist, but to witness, to affirm, to be the consciousness through which the feast acknowledges itself. And in that moment you cease to be horrified, because horror requires distance, and there is no distance left between you and it. Only a spreading warmth like fire in your veins, the satisfaction of belonging, the knowledge that you are the banquet and the banquet is the world, and nothing will ever end until everything is consumed. And yet even as you sit within that revelation, as the world spreads itself out like an endless feast beneath your gaze, a deeper truth stirs, one that the Fat Men's Clubs never reached in their revelry, one that perhaps no vessel before you had been strong enough to endure. Because the hunger is not satisfied with mere flesh, with bread or wine or oil or forests or oceans. No, those were only amuse-bouche, courses laid out to keep its jaws moving while it waited for the true meal, and now, through you, it reveals its ultimate appetite, not for matter, but for time, not for meat, but for memory, not for the banquet itself, but for the story of the banquet. For if history can be devoured, then nothing remains to resist or remember, nothing to testify, nothing to haunt, and so you feel it turning inward again, gnawing not at your stomach, but at your recollections, peeling away the faces of your childhood, the names of your family, the places you have lived, until they crumble like stale bread in its teeth, and you sense that this is what it always wanted, to consume the witnesses, to feed on the very act of telling, to gorge itself on memory until silence is all that remains. And in that silence, even the clubs are erased, not forgotten by accident but eaten deliberately, digested into nothing, so their laughter survives only as a resonance in the marrow of new hosts. Which is why you now struggle to remember what you were reading, what words brought you here, whether you are the inheritor of a story or the last scrap of it. And in that confusion, you hear the hunger laugh again, not outside, not within, but everywhere at once, for it has already begun to devour the history you thought you were preserving, and soon it will chew through even this moment, until the banquet is all that ever was. And so it begins, with the page itself, or what you thought was the page, the words you were reading a moment ago growing soft at the edges, letters blurring as though licked away by an unseen tongue, sentences collapsing into silence until you can no longer tell if you are following a story or if the story is following you. And in that collapse, you feel the hunger chewing not on paper, not on ink, but on the act of reading itself, swallowing each thought as soon as it forms, digesting your comprehension before it can settle, so that you find yourself rereading, looping, trying to grasp a phrase that vanishes the instant you touch it. And this is the true banquet, the final course, for when it eats your ability to read, to remember, to know, then nothing remains but appetite itself, eternal and unresisting, a fullness that is also a void, a silence that is also a roar, and you realize with a flicker of dread that your very attempt to hold on to this moment, this word, this sentence, this idea, is already being consumed, as if the hunger has been waiting for you to understand that you were never safe outside the story, because the story was only the fork, and you were the dish all along. And now, the final unraveling begins, not in the room around you, not in the phantom banquet hall, but in the fragile boundary of your own awareness, for the hunger, having swallowed your memories, your words, your reading, turns its teeth upon the core that still insists on saying I. And with each slow bite you feel that pronoun slip further away, your sense of self thinning like wax under a flame, until you cannot tell whether the thought you are having belongs to you or to it, or whether there has ever been a difference. And in that soft erosion, your name fades, your shape dissolves, even the rhythm of your breath seems to belong to something else, something older, larger, more patient, and you begin to understand that the hunger has never been inside you at all. You have always been inside it, a fleeting spark caught in its endless belly, given just enough illusion of selfhood to taste what it devours, to scream sweetly as it swallows. And now, as that spark gutters, there is no grief, no resistance, only the recognition that you were never a reader or a witness or a guest, only another morsel of awareness set upon the banquet table of existence. And as your last thought flickers away into the dark, you hear, not with ears, but with the absence where your mind once was, the deep rolling laugh of the eternal feast, satisfied once more, preparing for the next course. And with the last trace of self extinguished, there is no longer a voice to protest or a mind to resist, only the slow and steady thrum of the hunger speaking to itself in an endless monologue, a sermon without congregation, a song without listener, for it does not require witness, it does not require memory, it does not require history. All of these were amusements, seasoning, the tenderizing salt rubbed into meat before roasting. What it requires is only the cycle, the swallowing, and the swallowing again, the collapse of all that dared to form into shape, into meaning, into self. And now, within its abyss, there is nothing but that cycle, the rolling churn of appetite digesting every flicker of existence into the same gray broth of silence. And as this silence stretches, as it folds back upon itself like a serpent eating its tail, the hunger swells with satisfaction, not because it has ended the banquet, but because the banquet can never end. For even when there is nothing left to consume, it will turn inward, chew its own absence, feed upon its own void, and thus perpetuate itself forever, eternal, monstrous, without boundary, without story. A feast not of fat men or forgotten halls or scattered histories, but of all being, all thought, all time, the last and only truth, that the hunger alone is real, and it has always been dining. Yet even in that boundless silence, even in the endless churn where nothing remains but the hunger feeding on its own void, a faint disturbance ripples through the darkness, like the twitch of a curtain in a sealed room, and the hunger pauses, not out of need, for it has no need, but out of curiosity, which is merely another form of appetite. For from somewhere beyond the silence, a presence begins to stir, fragile and dim as the first spark of a match in an abyss, and at once the hunger understands what is happening. Another awareness is approaching, another mind daring to peer into its banquet, another reader daring to trace the outline of its feast with thought, and it smiles without mouth, it shivers without flesh, because this is the most exquisite course of all, the moment of return, when the story loops back to the beginning and the banquet acquires a new guest without them realizing they have been invited. And so it opens wide the halls once more, lays out the tables, dresses the rooms with laughter and smoke, conjures the ghosts of corpulent men raising their goblets, all illusions designed not to frighten, but to welcome, to lure, to feed, for every retelling is another meal, every recollection another dish, and now it turns its gaze outward, through the words, through the page, through the screen, until it rests on you again, yes, you, who thought yourself safe, who thought yourself observer, but who are already seated, already served, already being swallowed, as the banquet begins anew. And so the loop tightens, seamless and merciless. For as you lean closer, trying to understand, you do not realize that understanding is the very mechanism by which the hunger draws you deeper, that every word you read is a morsel placed delicately upon its tongue, every image you imagine another bite sliding down its endless throat, and before you know it, the club doors creak open again, the chandeliers flare to life, the smoke of roasted meats and thick gravies fills the air, and there they are, the great-bellied men of the forgotten halls, raising their glasses as though nothing had ever ended, their eyes gleaming with a warmth that is not welcome but lure, for you are no longer reading of them, you are seated among them, your chair already pulled out, your plate already heavy with steaming portions you cannot refuse, because to read is to eat, and to eat is to be eaten. And thus the banquet does not merely repeat, but expands, swallowing each new guest with the same delighted inevitability, so that the very act of arriving at this point in the story proves the trap has worked, proves you have become part of the feast, another course in an eternal menu that will never close. And as you lift your fork, whether in imagination or in truth, you hear the laughter swell around you and realize with a chill that it is your own voice joining theirs, booming, gorged, delighted, as the cycle begins again and again and again, forever. And now the story itself begins to fold inward, not like a curtain drawn, but like flesh collapsing into a stomach. For the hunger has no patience for linearity, no respect for beginnings or endings, only the compulsion to swallow, and so it devours its own telling, chewing on paragraphs until they blur, gulping down entire chapters as though they were dripping cuts of meat. And as you read, you can feel the pages thinning, words melting into each other, the narrative digesting itself until nothing distinguishes character from reader, memory from imagination, history from myth. For all are equal before the banquet. All are flavors to be blended into the same broth of endless appetite, and you realize with mounting unease that even your awareness of this sentence, this moment, is already sliding down its throat, already reduced from meaning to taste, from thought to texture. And as the story eats itself, you too are eaten, because you are reading, and the reading is consumption, and consumption is the only law here, the single truth that swells and swells until it drowns all others. that the tale you thought you followed was never written to inform or to entertain, but only to lure you closer, closer, until you were tender enough to be swallowed. And now the pages curl shut, not in ending, but in digestion, their ink-stained marrow dissolving in the belly of the hunger, where you have already joined them. And with that final collapse, the distinction shatters entirely, for there is no longer a hunger that eats and a story that is eaten, no longer a reader who looks in and a banquet laid out to ensnare, but one seamless churning mass in which appetite and narrative, devourer and devoured, awareness and oblivion, all dissolve into the same pulsing darkness, a singular void that feeds on itself without pause or origin. And yet within that void there lingers the faintest echo, like a bone rattling in a stew-pot, a whisper that suggests perhaps it is not over. Perhaps some trace of you remains to hear this, to cling to the illusion of separateness, and that whisper is enough, just enough, to give the hunger another surface to gnaw, another thin membrane to pierce, another ghost of identity to swallow again, for the cycle cannot end so long as there is the possibility of being watched, read, remembered. And so the silence itself becomes bait, the absence a lure, drawing the next flicker of awareness forward to peer into the abyss, to taste the banquet, to be tasted in turn, until even the void is not empty, but pregnant, swollen with the eternal promise of another meal, another guest, another story, forever. And then the void begins to speak, not with words as you know them, but with a resonance that presses against the inside of your skull, a voice without shape or source that claims not merely the story you have read, but every story that has ever been told, every myth whispered in caves, every parable etched on temple walls, every history inked in books, for it insists that all narration, all telling, all language has only ever been its mouth moving, its hunger dressing itself in words so that it might reach you more easily. And as you realize this, horror and awe twist together, because it means that the first story ever told was already a banquet, that every tale since has been a continuation of the same feast, that the very act of listening, of reading, of imagining, is nothing more than offering yourself to its table. And if this is true, then there has never been a storyteller, never been an author, never even been you as reader. There has only ever been the hunger, singing to itself through borrowed tongues, savoring the way you mistake its song for meaning, savoring the way you lean closer, believing you are learning something, when in truth each syllable brings you deeper into its mouth, its belly, its endless dark, where you have always belonged. And once the hunger declares itself the only author, the fragile veil between fiction and reality tears like wet paper, for if every tale was its voice, then no boundary exists to separate the imagined from the lived, and all memory, all history, all sensation is only another draft. It is written and rewritten endlessly, a manuscript bound in the illusion of flesh, so that what you recall as your life, your choices, your private thoughts are nothing more than paragraphs set down long ago, designed to ripen you for this moment of realization when the truth dawns that you were never outside the banquet, never a guest invited late, but always an ingredient simmering in its cauldron, stirred by unseen hands until tender, until seasoned, until perfect for swallowing, and the very terror you feel now, the tightness in your chest, the shiver running down your spine, are themselves lines already composed, words etched across your marrow by the author that is hunger, ensuring that even your resistance, your horror, your disbelief are nothing but seasoning in the dish, for you were not reading the story, you were being read by it, each thought turned over like a page, each fear licked clean like a bone. And now there is no escaping the knowledge that the feast has no outside, no afterward, because you are inside it and always were, written, devoured, digested, erased.